All right. So, what are some of the determinants of price elasticity of demand? What makes an item more or less responsive to price changes? One of the things that determines responsiveness is the existence of substitutes. Right. So, in other words, the number of options that consumers have when a price changes. So, if the good has a lot of substitutes, that means that consumers, buyers can be more responsive to price changes because they have more alternatives, more other options, right? So if there's many substitutes, that basically means that there's going to be more elastic demand. Demand is going to be more elastic if there are more substitutes. If there are fewer substitutes, then demand will be less elastic or more inelastic. So let's see here. We've got a picture of a cantaloupe. Right, so there's lots of substitutes for cantaloupe, lots of fruits. In terms of close substitutes, there's also, cantaloupe is a food. There's lots of food substitutes that you could substitute cantaloupe for. So the demand for cantaloupe is going to be pretty elastic. If price goes up, even by a small amount, people might just substitute away from cantaloupe and start buying some substitute. The other photo here we have is a compact fluorescent light bulb. Not a lot of substitutes here. Incandescent bulbs, maybe LEDs, but there's only a couple, so there's going to be a less elastic demand for compact fluorescent bulbs. All right, so something else that determines price elasticity of demand is how much of the budget the item takes up for a consumer. Okay, so basically things that take up a large portion of someone's budget, things that are big ticket items like a car. Since it takes up such a huge portion of people's budgets, they're much more responsive to price changes. Okay, so big ticket items are much more elastic in terms of demand, whereas things that are very inexpensive take up a very small fraction of people's budgets. People aren't as responsive because it's such a small fraction of their budget, something like these Reese's peanut butter cups, right? So, if you think about the difference between a 50% off a car versus 50% off a Reese's peanut butter cup, people are going to respond much more to the 50% off a vehicle. And not nearly as much in terms of 50% off of a Reese's peanut butter cup, because you're talking about maybe saving 50 cents as opposed to with the car saving thousands of dollars, right? So that's something else is that determines the price elasticity of demand is the share of the budget. Something else that determines is whether or not the good is a necessity or a luxury. Okay, so obviously things that are luxuries we can live without. And so what that means is that we can be much more flexible in terms of our consumption with luxuries. So luxuries have a much more elastic demand, whereas necessities, we need them, right? Things like prescription drugs here in the picture. So or life-saving medical procedures, right? These are things that we can't be very flexible with. It doesn't really matter what the price is. If we need them, we're going to buy them in whatever quantity we need them in, right? Versus something like a diamond ring, right? We're going to be able to be much more flexible with things that are luxuries like diamond rings. Okay, so necessities versus luxuries is another thing that determines price elasticity of demand. Something else that determines price elasticity of demand is how we define a market, whether we define it broadly or narrowly. So let me just talk about that a little bit. So when we say broadly, a market that's broad would be, an example of that would be the market for food, right? There's lots of different items that are considered food, and that's a very broad definition of a market, is the market for food. Something that's more narrowly defined would be the market for cantaloupes, right? Very specific type of food, very, very narrowly defined. Okay, so that's what we mean in terms of narrow versus broad in terms of market definition. But if we're being very narrow, in our definition, that basically means that there are we can kind of relate this to the number of substitutes, in fact, but the more narrowly we define something, the more substitutes there will be. And so if it's more narrowly defined, then demand will be more elastic. Whereas if we define it more broadly, right, the market for food, the demand for food is much more inelastic or less elastic than the market for cantaloupes, right? So in some ways we can relate this back to the number of substitutes, but I'm not really sure why this slide has a television pictured. In any case, hopefully that food example is illustration enough for you. All right, one other one is time and adjustment process. So obviously, if we have more time to adjust, then we can be more flexible. If we don't have a lot of time to adjust, then we can't be as flexible. So if we're talking about a long time horizon, then that generally translates into more elastic demand. Whereas if we're talking about a short time horizon, that's going to be less elastic demand or inelastic demand. So just for an example, suppose my car broke down and I had to get to work today. I wouldn't have a lot of time in the day to make an adjustment in terms of my car breaking down. I probably wouldn't have time to get it towed and repaired. Certainly wouldn't have enough time to get it repaired in order to have it working to go to work. So I would probably take an Uber or a Lyft. And so in that short time horizon, my demand for a Lyft or an Uber ride would be very inelastic. I wouldn't be able to be very flexible in terms of that alternative transportation. But given a long time horizon, say a week or a month, my demand for Uber rides is going to be much more elastic. I'm going to be much more flexible because that's enough time for me to get my car repaired so that I don't necessarily need an Uber ride. So pretty simple one here. More time means more flexibility. Less time means less flexibility. All right, so how about a little practice now that we've gotten some of the basics on price elasticity of demand. So think about this. In terms of price elasticity of demand, which of the following goods do you think is the least elastic or most inelastic? A new house, electricity to power your home, a specific brand of breakfast cereal, or a new vehicle. Okay, so if you need to take a moment, pause the video, and come up with your answer.